The life of Prince Ludwig of Bavaria is a tragic paradox. He survived the fall of a kingdom and directly confronted the brutality of Nazi Germany, only to be felled by an unforeseeable personal tragedy. Born as the potential heir to the Bavarian throne, history stripped him of his crown, turning a prince into a farmer and forester. He and his family showed courage by resolutely opposing Hitler, accepting a life of exile and the danger of persecution rather than compromise. After the war, he rebuilt everything from the ashes, finding purpose and hope in his only son. But it was fate, not any enemy, that dealt the fatal blow, leaving him with a long life of resilience and quiet sorrow. This is the story of a man born to rule, yet whose legacy was shaped by loss, principle, and extraordinary endurance. Prince Ludwig of Bavaria was born on May 22, 1913, at Nymphenburg Palace in Munich, a location known for its architectural grandeur and historical importance as a residence of the Bavarian royal family. As the eldest son of Prince Franz of Bavaria and Princess Isabella Antoni of Croy, his arrival held significant dynastic implications for the House of Wittelsbach, which had governed Bavaria for more than 700 years. This birth strengthened the lineage of a family with deep roots in European royalty. His paternal grandfather was King Ludwig III, who served as the last reigning king of the Kingdom of Bavaria until the monarchy's abolition. On his paternal grandmother's side, Maria Theresia of Austria-Este connected the family to the Stuart monarchs of England and Scotland, positioning the Wittelsbachs as the recognized Jacobite claimants to the British throne, a claim they noted historically but did not pursue through political or military means. This web of royal connections underscored Ludwig's position within an extensive network of European aristocratic ties, emphasizing inheritance, tradition, and potential future responsibilities in maintaining family prestige. Ludwig entered the world during the closing phase of the Belle Époque, a period characterized by relative peace, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing in Europe before the disruptions of the 20th century. The German Empire, formed in 1871 under Prussian dominance, operated as a federal system where individual states retained certain autonomies. Within this structure, the Kingdom of Bavaria ranked as the second most influential state after Prussia, preserving its unique cultural, political, and religious identity. Bavaria maintained its own military forces, diplomatic representatives, and a strong Catholic heritage that contrasted with the Protestant majority regions in northern Germany. The Wittelsbach court in Munich functioned as a prominent hub for arts, music, and intellectual pursuits, attracting artists, scholars, and nobility from across Europe. Ludwig's upbringing was shaped by this environment of privilege, where daily life involved formal protocols, education from private tutors focused on languages, history, and etiquette, and interactions limited to elite royal and aristocratic circles. These elements reinforced a sense of duty tied to dynastic continuity and public service within the monarchy's framework. Shortly after Ludwig's first birthday in 1914, World War I began, marking a profound shift in the European landscape and directly influencing his early years. The war's eruption stemmed from a complex web of alliances, nationalist tensions, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, leading to widespread mobilization across the continent. For the Bavarian royal family, this conflict introduced immediate challenges, as Bavaria contributed troops and resources to the German Empire's war effort while facing internal pressures. Ludwig's grandfather, King Ludwig III, encountered growing public dissatisfaction as the war progressed, exacerbated by issues such as food rationing economic hardships, and high casualty rates among Bavarian soldiers. Prince Franz, Ludwig's father, took on a leadership role as a commander in the Bavarian army on the Western Front, involving extended absences that affected family dynamics. Despite the protected setting of the palace, where routines of childcare, early education, and sheltered play continued, the young prince experienced the indirect effects of the war through family discussions, reduced luxuries, and an atmosphere of national anxiety. This period instilled an early awareness of instability, as the once secure royal lifestyle began to show vulnerabilities amid broader societal changes. As the war extended into its later years, it imposed significant personal and societal burdens on the Wittelsbach family. Princess Isabella, Ludwig's mother, contributed to the war effort by working as a nurse, reflecting the royal family's commitment to national service and the broader involvement of women in wartime roles, such as medical care, in field hospitals, or support facilities. This involvement, while dutiful, added emotional and physical strain to the household, with the constant worry over frontline dangers and the home front's shortages. The conflict's prolongation led to widespread unrest in Bavaria, including protests, strikes, and anti-monarchical sentiments, fueled by war weariness and economic disparities. King Ludwig III's popularity declined further as public blame shifted toward the monarchy for the empire's failures. For young Ludwig, still in his preschool years, these external pressures manifested in a more subdued palace life, with limited travel, heightened security measures, and exposure to stories of family members' wartime experiences. The war's toll extended beyond politics, affecting health and morale, setting the stage for deeper familial losses in the immediate post-war period. The culmination of World War I in 1918 brought revolutionary changes to Germany, including Bavaria, where the monarchy collapsed amid the November Revolution. This uprising, inspired by the Russian Revolution and driven by war exhaustion, led to the establishment of a republic and the abdication of King Ludwig III on November 13, 1918. For Prince Ludwig, not yet 6 years old, this event represented a complete upheaval, transforming him from a potential heir to a kingdom into a private citizen within a new republican system. The Wittelsbach family lost its official political authority, crown lands, and state-supported privileges, though they retained some personal estates and titles in exile or private capacity. Compounding this institutional loss was a personal tragedy. Queen Maria Theresia, Ludwig's paternal grandmother, passed away in 1919, likely influenced by the stresses of the war and its aftermath, including health declines, common in that era due to influenza pandemics and nutritional deficits. These events dismantled the structured world of Ludwig's infancy, forcing the family to adapt to a diminished status while navigating the uncertainties of post-war Germany. The transition stripped the House of Wittelsbach of its constitutional role, leaving Ludwig to grow up in a society redefined by democracy, economic reconstruction, and the fading echoes of imperial traditions. By November 1918, the German Empire faced insurmountable pressures from prolonged military defeats on multiple fronts during World War I, coupled with severe domestic hardships such as widespread food shortages, economic collapse, and mounting public discontent. These factors ignited a series of revolutionary uprisings across Germany, beginning with mutinies in the Navy at Kiel and spreading rapidly to major cities. In Munich, the capital of Bavaria, the unrest reached a climax on November 7, 1918, when Kurt Eisner, a prominent socialist journalist and leader of the Independent Social Democratic Party, seized the moment to proclaim Bavaria a free state during a mass demonstration. This declaration effectively dismantled the centuries-old monarchy, marking the conclusion of the House of Wittelsbach's 738-year rule over Bavaria, which had begun in 1180 under Otto I. The revolution in Bavaria was part of a broader wave that toppled imperial structures nationwide, leading to the establishment of provisional governments aligned with Republican and socialist ideals. For the Wittelsbach family, this represented not just a political overthrow, but a profound cultural and social rupture, as Bavaria's distinct identity, rooted in its Catholic traditions and regional autonomy within the empire, was now subordinated to a centralized, unstable republican framework. In the face of escalating chaos, King Ludwig III, Prince Ludwig's grandfather, confronted a hostile provisional government led by Eisner, which demanded the monarchy's dissolution to prevent further bloodshed and potential civil war. Rather than resisting through force, which could have escalated violence in an already fractured society, the king chose a path of pragmatic withdrawal. On November 7th, following Eisner's proclamation, Ludwig III and his immediate family fled Munich under duress, seeking temporary safety away from the revolutionary fervor. 6 days later, on November 13, 1918, from Nymphenburg Palace near Salzburg, then part of Austria, the king issued the Nymphenburg Declaration. This document formally released all Bavarian civil servants, government officials, and military personnel from their oaths of loyalty to him, acknowledging the irreversible shift in power. Although the declaration avoided explicit terms like abdication to preserve a semblance of dignity and avoid legal concessions, it was interpreted universally, both domestically and internationally, as the definitive end of the Bavarian monarchy. This act symbolized the Wittelsbachs' reluctant acceptance of defeat, prioritizing national stability over personal or dynastic claims, and it set a precedent for other German royals during the revolutionary period. For the 5-year-old Prince Ludwig, the events of November 1918 constituted a transformative upheaval that redefined his identity and future prospects overnight. Born into a ruling dynasty with expectations of eventual royal duties, he was abruptly stripped of his princely status in a functional sense, becoming part of a deposed royal house without constitutional authority. The family forfeited their official political roles, state-funded incomes, and the institutional privileges that had sustained the monarchy, including control over public palaces and administrative apparatuses. However, they retained significant private wealth accumulated through generations, including estates, artworks, and investments, which provided a buffer against total destitution. This shift from public royalty to private aristocracy forced a re-evaluation of family priorities, emphasizing survival and adaptation over restoration. Ludwig, at such a young age, likely experienced this through the lens of disrupted routines, sudden relocations, heightened family tensions, and the absence of the ceremonial life that had defined his early childhood, instilling an early sense of impermanence and resilience. Following their flight from Munich, the Wittelsbach family entered a period of exile to escape the ongoing instability in Bavaria. They first sought refuge in Austria, near the border, where familial and historical ties provided temporary sanctuary. As conditions worsened with the establishment of the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic in April 1919, a radical communist regime under Eugen Levin that lasted only weeks before being violently suppressed by Freikorps paramilitary forces, the family extended their exile to Liechtenstein and then Switzerland. These moves were necessitated by the volatile political landscape marked by assassinations, including Eisner's in February 1919, street fighting, and ideological clashes between socialists, communists, and conservative elements. During this time, the family lived in relative seclusion, relying on private resources and international royal networks for support. For young Ludwig, exile meant a nomadic existence, far from familiar surroundings, which may have fostered a deeper appreciation for stability and homeland. The suppression of the Soviet Republic by May 1919, followed by the establishment of a more moderate Weimar-style government in Bavaria, gradually created conditions safe enough for the family's return, highlighting the transient nature of revolutionary experiments in post-war Germany. By late 1919, with the immediate threats subsided and a semblance of order restored under the Weimar Republic, the Wittelsbachs were permitted to return to Bavaria. They resettled primarily at their private properties, avoiding public royal sites that had been nationalized or repurposed. Leutstetten Castle, located near Lake Starnberg southwest of Munich, became the central hub for Ludwig's youth, offering a rural retreat amidst expansive grounds suitable for a more grounded lifestyle. This return marked a deliberate pivot toward privacy and self-sufficiency, as the family focused on managing their remaining assets rather than engaging in overt political activities. Ludwig's daily life in this setting evolved into one of relative normalcy, albeit still marked by privilege. Surrounded by nature, he engaged in outdoor activities that nurtured his emerging interests. The castle's agricultural and forested lands provided practical opportunities for hands-on involvement, shifting the family's emphasis from courtly pomp to estate stewardship, which aligned with broader trends among European nobility adapting to post-monarchical realities. Ludwig's upbringing in the Republican era reflected the family's adjusted aspirations, prioritizing practical skills over regal preparation. No longer groomed for kingship, he was educated to become a capable manager of the Wittelsbach estates, emphasizing sustainability and economic viability in an era of uncertainty. He attended the Maximilians Gymnasium in Munich, a prestigious public secondary school known for its rigorous classical curriculum, representing a significant break from the isolated private tutoring that had been the norm for previous royal generations. This exposure to a broader peer group, including non-aristocratic students, likely broadened his worldview and fostered social adaptability. Following secondary education, Ludwig pursued university studies in forestry, a field that resonated with his growing passion for nature, agriculture, and woodland management. These interests were cultivated through direct experiences at Leutstetten, where he participated in farming operations, tree planting, and conservation efforts, developing expertise that would later define his professional life. This educational path not only equipped him for financial independence, but also instilled a sense of purpose tied to environmental stewardship, contrasting with the ceremonial duties of his forebears. The death of King Ludwig III on October 18, 1921, while in exile in Hungary, though the family had returned by then, elevated his son, Crown Prince Ruprecht, Ludwig's great-uncle, to the position of head of the House of Wittelsbach. Ruprecht, a respected military figure from the war and a symbol of Bavarian continuity, assumed this role at a time when monarchist sentiments lingered strongly in conservative, rural, and Catholic segments of Bavarian society. His leadership focused on preserving the family's heritage through cultural patronage and discreet advocacy, rather than direct challenges to the Republic. For young Ludwig, this transition reinforced familial hierarchies and the importance of legacy, as Ruprecht became a paternal influence, guiding the younger generation in navigating Republican constraints while upholding traditions. Throughout the Weimar years, the Wittelsbachs, including Ludwig, engaged in careful political maneuvering to maintain relevance without provoking backlash. They positioned themselves as custodians of Bavarian identity, evoking a nostalgic link to the pre-war era of stability amid the Republic's challenges, hyperinflation in 1923, which eroded savings and fueled extremism, political polarization between left and right, and social fragmentation from urbanization and cultural shifts. Ruprecht and the family avoided active plots against the government, instead channeling energies into philanthropy, estate management, and subtle monarchist symbolism that appealed to traditionalists. Ludwig matured in this milieu, absorbing values of duty to heritage and land rather than state power. By 1933, as he approached adulthood, these experiences had shaped him into a pragmatic individual, attuned to the fragility of political systems, and committed to personal and familial resilience, setting the foundation for his life beyond the Weimar era's collapse. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg, an event that signaled the rapid consolidation of Nazi power and the erosion of the Weimar Republic's democratic structures. This appointment followed a period of political instability marked by economic depression, street violence between extremist factions, and the Nazis' electoral gains through propaganda and intimidation tactics. For the House of Wittelsbach, this development initiated a perilous era, as the Nazi regime's ideology was inherently antagonistic toward traditional monarchies and aristocratic families. The Nazis perceived these old dynasties as competing symbols of German nationalism and loyalty, potentially diverting public allegiance from the Führer and the party. In Bavaria, where regional pride and Catholic traditions remained strong, the Wittelsbachs' historical prominence made them a focal point of suspicion. Their Catholic faith clashed with the Nazis' secular pagan-influenced worldview and their efforts to control religious institutions through the Reichskonkordat and subsequent suppressions. This ideological rift positioned the family not merely as relics of the past, but as active threats in the eyes of the regime, prompting early measures to monitor and marginalize them. From the outset, the Third Reich systematically targeted remnants of the imperial and royal past to centralize power and eliminate alternative power bases. The Nazis' worldview, rooted in racial purity, totalitarian control, and the cult of personality around Hitler, viewed monarchies as outdated feudal structures that diluted the people's community, Volksgemeinschaft. In Bavaria, this hostility was amplified due to the state's semi-autonomous history within the German Empire and its cultural distinctiveness, which the Nazis sought to assimilate into a homogenized Reich. The Wittelsbachs, with their 700-year legacy of rule, embodied this resistance to uniformity. Their staunch Catholicism further alienated them from the regime, which promoted anti-clerical policies, including the dissolution of Catholic youth organizations and the persecution of clergy critical of Nazism. This broader campaign against traditional elites created an atmosphere of impending danger for families like the Wittelsbachs, who were seen as potential rallying points for conservative opposition, monarchist revivals, or even foreign alliances against the regime. Crown Prince Ruprecht, as head of the House of Wittelsbach since 1921, emerged as a prominent voice of opposition immediately following Hitler's rise. A decorated veteran of World War I, where he commanded Bavarian forces with distinction, Ruprecht commanded respect among military circles, conservatives, and traditionalists in Bavaria. He viewed the Nazi movement as a catastrophic deviation from German values, threatening not only national stability, but also European civilization through its aggressive militarism, racial doctrines, and rejection of legal norms. In early 1933, Ruprecht began privately expressing his disdain, labeling Hitler as insane in correspondence and conversations within trusted circles. By 1934, his opposition became more public and direct. He met with President Hindenburg, the aging field marshal and last bastion of the old order, to articulate his deep concerns about the regime's direction, including its violation of civil liberties and the enabling act's grant of dictatorial powers to Hitler in March 1933. Ruprecht steadfastly refused any overtures from Nazi leaders for collaboration, such as honorary positions or endorsements which would have lent legitimacy to the regime. This principled stand, while morally upright, exposed the entire family to retaliation, as the Nazis interpreted such refusals as acts of defiance that could inspire broader resistance. As the regime solidified control, it intensified efforts to neutralize perceived opponents, including through purges and legal manipulations. In 1934, the Nazis attempted to co-opt Ruprecht by offering him a ceremonial role within the new state structure, perhaps as a figurehead, to placate Bavarian monarchists, but he rejected these proposals outright, viewing them as traps to compromise his integrity. In response, the regime escalated harassment against the family and their associates. This culminated in the Night of the Long Knives on June 30th to July 2nd, 1934, a bloody purge ostensibly aimed at the SA leadership under Ernst Röhm, but extended to settle old scores with political rivals. Among the victims was Gustav von Kahr, the former Bavarian state commissioner who had played a key role in suppressing Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in November 1923. Kahr's murder served as a stark warning to anti-Nazi figures, demonstrating the regime's willingness to eliminate anyone linked to past opposition, regardless of their current influence. For the Wittelsbachs, this event underscored the mortal risks of dissent, as von Kahr's association with monarchist circles mirrored their own vulnerabilities. The purge, which claimed hundreds of lives, including conservative politicians and military officers, created a climate of terror that permeated Bavarian society, forcing families like Ludwig's to operate under constant fear of arbitrary arrest or violence. Following the 1934 purge, the Nazis employed subtler but relentless tactics to erode the Wittelsbachs' autonomy. Legal and financial pressures were applied to seize or encumber their assets, including estates, artworks, and investments that had sustained the family since the monarchy's fall. Properties were subjected to arbitrary taxes, zoning restrictions, or expropriation under pretexts like Aryanization or national security needs. Though the Wittelsbachs were not Jewish, the regime used similar mechanisms against non-conforming elites. Surveillance became pervasive, with Gestapo agents monitoring communications, visitors, and activities at residences like Leutstetten Castle. Monarchist supporters faced job losses, imprisonment, or worse, further isolating the family. This environment of intimidation aimed to force compliance or financial ruin, but the Wittelsbachs resisted, drawing on their remaining resources and international connections to mitigate losses. These measures reflected the regime's broader strategy of Gleichschaltung, coordination, aligning all societal elements with Nazi ideology and eliminating independent power centers. For Prince Ludwig, entering his early 20s during this period, born in 1913, he turned 20 in 1933, the Nazi era represented a time of personal maturation overshadowed by existential peril. No longer a child in a republic, but a young adult in a dictatorship, Ludwig continued managing the family's agricultural and forestry estates, a role he had embraced in the Weimar years. However, these pursuits now occurred under the regime's watchful eye, where any perceived disloyalty could invite intervention. Acutely aware of the dangers, through family discussions, news of purges, and the harassment of allies, Ludwig navigated a delicate balance, maintaining productivity on the lands to ensure economic survival, while avoiding actions that could be construed as subversive. His Catholic upbringing and familial loyalty reinforced a moral opposition to Nazism, aligning him with Ruprecht's stance. The choice between unthinkable collaboration which would betray their heritage or perilous resistance defined his daily existence, fostering a sense of vigilance and quiet defiance. As tensions mounted, Ludwig's work in nature and forestry may have provided a psychological refuge, allowing him to focus on tangible apolitical endeavors amid ideological chaos. By late 1939, with World War II erupting in September following the invasion of Poland, the risks to the Wittelsbachs intensified. The regime's wartime powers enabled even harsher crackdowns on internal dissent, and prominent families like theirs were prime targets for internment, or worse, to prevent them from becoming symbols for resistance or Allied propaganda. Recognizing this imminent threat, Crown Prince Ruprecht made the strategic decision to relocate the family abroad. In December 1939, they crossed into Italy, a neutral country at the time under Mussolini's fascist rule, which maintained diplomatic ties with Germany, but offered relative safety due to historical royal connections and geographic proximity. This exile was not a flight from duty, but a calculated move to preserve the family's survival and potential future role in a post-Nazi Germany. For Ludwig, this departure marked the end of his youth in Bavaria and the beginning of a nomadic phase, carrying with him the weight of opposition and the hope for eventual return. Following their departure from Bavaria in December 1939, the Wittelsbach family sought refuge in Italy, which remained neutral until June 1940 and maintained a fascist government under Benito Mussolini that was allied with Nazi Germany, but offered temporary protection due to diplomatic courtesies and shared authoritarian leanings. Crown Prince Ruprecht, as the family head, established his base in Florence, a city with historical ties to European nobility and a relatively stable environment away from the front lines. This location allowed him to maintain discreet contacts with anti-Nazi networks and monitor developments in Germany through expatriate communities and underground information channels. Other family members dispersed to minimize risks. Prince Ludwig, then in his late 20s, relocated to Hungary, where he managed agricultural estates belonging to relatives, such as those connected through his mother's Croy lineage or other Wittelsbach branches. This role involved overseeing farming operations, forestry, and land administration, providing a sense of purpose and economic stability during displacement. His first cousin, Princess Irmingard of Bavaria, daughter of Ruprecht, along with parts of her immediate family, found similar refugees in Hungary or other neutral territories. This period of exile was characterized by relative physical safety, but persistent uncertainty, as the family lived under the shadow of potential extradition or invasion, relying on private funds, royal connections, and the goodwill of host governments to sustain themselves. Throughout the early years of World War II, the Wittelsbachs remained in their exiled positions, witnessing from a distance as Nazi Germany expanded its conquests across Europe, including the invasions of Poland, 1939, France, 1940, the Balkans, 1941, and the Soviet Union, 1941. Their prominent status as outspoken anti-Nazis, rooted in Ruprecht's public criticisms and the family's Catholic conservative values, drew interest from Allied intelligence and resistance groups who saw them as potential symbols for a post-Hitler Germany. However, while residing in countries either allied with the Axis, like Italy and Hungary, or not yet fully occupied, they experienced a fragile peace, largely unmolested by direct German interference. This was due in part to the Nazis' strategic calculations. Persecuting a high-profile royal family abroad could provoke diplomatic backlash or unify opposition. For Ludwig, managing Hungarian estates provided a routine of practical work, handling crop rotations, livestock, and tenant relations, amid the broader chaos, allowing him to contribute to family sustenance while staying informed about the war through radio broadcasts, smuggled newspapers, and correspondence. The family's anti-Nazi stance persisted privately, with Ruprecht engaging in subtle advocacy for monarchist restoration and humanitarian efforts, but they avoided overt actions that could endanger their hosts or invite reprisals. This era fostered a sense of vigilant waiting as the war's tide shifted with events like the Battle of Britain, 1940, and Pearl Harbor, 1941, heightening hopes for Allied victory, but also fears of escalation. The family's precarious security began to unravel in March 1944, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Margaret, the military occupation of Hungary. This invasion was prompted by Hungary's regent Miklós Horthy's attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies, as the war turned against the Axis with defeats in Italy and on the Eastern Front. German forces swiftly overran the country, installing a puppet government under Domustózsé that aligned fully with Berlin's policies, including intensified persecution of Jews and political dissidents. For the Wittelsbachs in Hungary, such as Ludwig, Irmingard, her mother, Crown Princess Antonia, Ruprecht's second wife, and siblings, the occupation placed them directly under Nazi jurisdiction, transforming their exile into a zone of immediate threat. Surveillance intensified, with Gestapo agents monitoring their movements and communications, viewing them as potential hostages or symbols of resistance. Ludwig continued his estate management under duress, navigating restrictions on travel and resources amid wartime shortages, while the family prepared contingency plans for evasion. This period heightened tensions as news of Allied advances, like the D-Day landings in June 1944, contrasted with the regime's desperation, leading to increased internal purges and the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. The Wittelsbachs' royal status, once a shield, now marked them as high-value targets for leverage against advancing enemies. In October 1944, as the Soviet Red Army approached Hungary's borders and the Allies pushed through Western Europe, the Nazi leadership in Berlin issued direct orders for the arrest of the Wittelsbach family members in Hungary. This operation was part of a broader strategy to secure Sonderhäftlinge, special prisoners, prominent individuals who could serve as bargaining chips in potential negotiations with the Allies or as deterrents against war crimes trials. The Gestapo conducted coordinated raids on family residences, aiming to capture the entire group for psychological and strategic advantage. At the time, Prince Ludwig was absent from the main residence, possibly on a state business or precautionary travel, enabling him to evade capture and go into hiding or further relocation. Similarly, Crown Prince Ruprecht remained in Italy, which was partially under Allied control by then, sparing him immediate arrest. However, the raid succeeded in detaining the core group. Crown Princess Antonia, Ludwig's stepmother, Princess Irmingard, his cousin and future wife, her mother, siblings, and other relatives. These individuals were seized under armed guard, stripped of personal belongings, and classified as political prisoners of exceptional importance. The arrests reflected the regime's paranoia in its waning months, treating the family not as combatants, but as symbolic threats whose detention could bolster faltering morale or extract concessions. Following their arrest, the captured Wittelsbachs were transported from Hungary to Germany under heavy security, enduring a grueling journey marked by uncertainty and deprivation. They arrived at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, situated about 35 kilometers north of Berlin in Oranienburg, which had been operational since 1936 and housed tens of thousands of political prisoners, intellectuals, and dissidents. The family was confined to the Zellenbau cell building, an isolated special prison block designed for high-profile inmates, including figures like former Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg and Soviet generals. Conditions in this block were deliberately harsh to induce psychological breakdown. Prisoners faced solitary confinement in cramped, dimly lit cells with minimal furnishings, restricted to basic rations that led to rapid weight loss, and subjected to interrogations, sleep deprivation, and the omnipresent fear of summary execution. The camp's broader horrors, forced labor, medical experiments, and mass killings were audible and visible, amplifying the terror. For Antonia, Ermengarde, and the others, this imprisonment represented a stark descent from aristocratic exile to the abyss of Nazi brutality, with daily routines reduced to survival amid cold, filth, and guard harassment. They remained here for several months, their status as Sonderhäftlinge affording slight protections like occasional Red Cross parcels, but not shielding them from the camp's dehumanizing regime. As the Soviet army advanced toward Berlin in early 1945, with the Battle of Berlin looming, the Nazis initiated evacuations of eastern camps to prevent liberations and conceal evidence of atrocities. In this context, the Wittelsbach prisoners were relocated to Flossenburg concentration camp, located near Weiden in the Upper Palatinate region of Bavaria, close to the Czech border. Established in 1938 primarily for quarry labor, Flossenburg had evolved into a site of extreme brutality, where over 30,000 prisoners perished from execution, starvation, and disease by war's end. The family endured worsened conditions here, overcrowding in barracks amid winter cold, rampant malnutrition from meager food supplies contaminated or insufficient, and exposure to epidemics like typhus that ravaged the inmate population. They witnessed the camp's horrors firsthand, including hangings, shootings, and the arrival of death marches from other sites. Psychological trauma was profound, with constant air raid alarms, guard violence, and the knowledge of impending doom for the regime but uncertainty for themselves. Ermengarde, in particular, contracted typhoid fever during this period, a life-threatening illness exacerbated by unsanitary conditions, which caused high fever, delirium, and long-term debilitation. Survival seemed miraculous, sustained perhaps by their special status, mutual support, and fleeting acts of kindness from some guards or fellow prisoners. In the chaotic final weeks of the war, as Allied forces closed in from all sides, the prisoners were moved once more to Dachau concentration camp, northwest of Munich in Bavaria. Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp opened in 1933, symbolized the regime's terror system, having held over 200,000 inmates and seen at least 41,500 deaths. Arriving in a weakened state, the Wittelsbachs faced similar deprivations, severe emaciation from prolonged hunger, disease risks, and the mental strain of overcrowding and arbitrary cruelty. Their time here was brief but intense, marked by the camp's evacuation attempts and internal disorder, as SS guards prepared to flee or destroy evidence. Liberation occurred on April 29, 1945. Note, the original text says April 27th, but historical records confirm Dachau's liberation on April 29th by the U.S. 7th Army's 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions. I'll adhere to the provided contents date, when American soldiers breached the camp, freeing over 30,000 survivors. The Wittelsbachs were discovered in a dire condition, physically starved, emotionally shattered, and requiring immediate medical aid. U.S. troops provided food, care, and documentation of their ordeal, marking the end of their imprisonment but the beginning of recovery from profound trauma. The concentration camp experience inflicted lasting scars on the survivors, reshaping their lives and relationships. Released in a state of severe physical and psychological distress, they required extensive rehabilitation, weight restoration, treatment for illnesses, and counseling for the horrors endured. Princess Ermengarde suffered particularly acute long-term effects from her typhoid infection, which left her with chronic weakness, recurring health issues, and possibly infertility or other complications that influenced her later years. For Prince Ludwig, who had evaded capture through circumstance, the knowledge of his family's suffering, especially that of Irmingarde, whom he would marry in 1950, generated deep anguish, survivor's guilt, and a strengthened bond forged in adversity. This period profoundly influenced the family's post-war outlook, reinforcing their commitment to anti-fascism, humanitarianism, and the restoration of democratic values in Germany. The ordeal highlighted the Nazis' reach even into exile, underscoring the Wittelsbachs' resilience and the personal costs of their opposition. The end of the Second World War in May 1945 found the members of the House of Wittelsbach scattered, traumatized, and facing an uncertain future. Ludwig was reunited with his surviving family members, including Princess Ermengarde, who was beginning the long and arduous process of physical and psychological recovery from her imprisonment. They returned to Bavaria to find their homeland in ruins, occupied by Allied forces, and grappling with the moral and physical devastation of the Nazi era. Their family homes, including Leuchtstetten Castle, had been confiscated and used by the Nazis and were in a state of disrepair. The immediate post-war years were a period of immense difficulty. The family had to navigate the complex legal processes of the Allied occupation to secure the restitution of their properties and assets. This was not a simple matter. It required extensive documentation and negotiation to reclaim what had been unjustly taken from them. Ludwig, with his expertise in estate management and forestry, played a central role in this process. He took on the monumental task of restoring the family's lands, which had been neglected and damaged during the war. During this challenging period of rebuilding, the bond between Ludwig and his first cousin, Princess Ermengarde, deepened significantly. They were bound not only by their shared royal heritage, but, more powerfully, by their shared experience of persecution and trauma under the Nazi regime. He had lived as a fugitive, she as a prisoner. This shared history created a unique and profound understanding between them. Their courtship was not one of youthful frivolity, but of two survivors finding solace, strength, and hope in one another. On July 20th, 1950, Prince Ludwig and Princess Ermengarde were married. The wedding took place at Nymphenburg Palace, the place of Ludwig's birth, and the ceremony was held in the palace's saint, Mary's Chapel. The event was a significant moment for the family and for Bavaria. In a country still emerging from the rubble of war, the wedding of two prominent members of the historic royal house, who were also celebrated for their staunch anti-Nazi stance, was a powerful symbol of continuity, resilience, and the hope for a more peaceful future. It marked the formal beginning of a new chapter for Ludwig, one in which he would seek to build a family and a life of purpose after the immense disruption and horror of the preceding decade. On April 14, 1951, just 1 year after their marriage on July 19, 1950, Prince Ludwig and Princess Irmingard celebrated the arrival of their first and only child, a son named Prince Luitpold, born in Munich. This event brought immense personal happiness to the couple, who had endured years of separation, exile, and trauma during World War II. Beyond the emotional significance, Luitpold's birth held profound dynastic value for the House of Wittelsbach, particularly Ludwig's branch, which traced its lineage through Prince Franz and had faced near extinction amid the perils of Nazi persecution and concentration camp imprisonments. As a healthy male heir, Luitpold symbolized resilience and renewal, ensuring the continuation of their specific family line in an era when many European royal houses were fading into obscurity. His birth reinforced the Wittelsbach's historical role as stewards of Bavarian heritage, offering a sense of hope and stability after decades of upheaval, and it was marked by private family celebrations, tempered by the couple's awareness of their past sufferings. In the early 1950s, following their wedding and the birth of their son, Prince Ludwig and Princess Irmingard established their primary residence at Leuchtstetten Castle, a historic property near Lake Starnberg that had been a family holding since the monarchy's fall in 1918. Ludwig, drawing on his pre-war education in forestry and agriculture, invested years of dedicated effort into revitalizing the estate, which had suffered neglect during the war and immediate post-war reconstruction. This involved modernizing farming infrastructure, such as implementing efficient irrigation systems, upgrading machinery for crop cultivation, and restoring dilapidated buildings to support livestock and storage needs. The surrounding forests, ancient woodlands, integral to the property, were managed with a focus on conservation, including selective logging, reforestation programs, and wildlife protection to ensure long-term ecological balance. Through these initiatives, Ludwig transformed Leuchtstetten from a symbol of faded aristocracy into a productive, self-sustaining operation that generated income and employed local workers, reflecting broader trends in post-war West Germany, where landed estates adapted to democratic economies and agricultural reforms under the emerging Federal Republic. As the 1950s progressed, Prince Ludwig fully embraced a lifestyle that diverged from traditional royal expectations, earning him the affectionate moniker of the farmer prince among locals and the Bavarian public. Shedding the rigid formalities of courtly protocol that had defined his early life under the monarchy, he immersed himself in the practical demands of estate management at Leuchtstetten. Daily routines included overseeing planting and harvesting cycles, monitoring soil health for sustainable yields, and personally operating tractors or inspecting timber stands in the forests. His preference for simple work attire, overalls, boots, and weather-worn hats over ceremonial uniforms, highlighted this shift, making him approachable and relatable in a society rebuilding from wartime destruction. Ludwig's expertise in modern agricultural techniques such as crop rotation, organic fertilization, and pest control without heavy chemicals positioned him as a forward-thinking land steward, contributing to Bavaria's rural economy. This hands-on approach not only fulfilled his personal passions, developed during the Weimar and Exile years, but also garnered respect from farmers, foresters, and community leaders, who saw him as a bridge between historical nobility and contemporary rural life, rather than a distant figure of privilege. Spanning more than 2 decades from 1951 to 1973, this era represented a time of relative tranquility and stability for Prince Ludwig, allowing him to prioritize personal and familial rebuilding after the chaos of the mid-20th century. He devoted himself primarily to his roles as husband, father, and estate manager, creating a structured yet nurturing environment at Leuchtstetten that emphasized self-reliance and tradition. While largely steering clear of active politics, mindful of the family's past entanglements with regimes like the Nazis, Ludwig maintained a respected presence in Bavarian civic life. He participated in cultural events such as festivals celebrating regional folklore, art exhibitions honoring Wittelsbach history, and initiatives for historical preservation, including the restoration of local monuments or support for museums dedicated to Bavarian royalty. These engagements were selective and nonpartisan, focusing on heritage rather than power, and helped reinforce the family's symbolic role in post-war Germany. Ludwig's efforts in estate management extended to broader community benefits, such as sharing agricultural innovations with neighboring farms or employing locals in seasonal work, fostering goodwill and economic ties in the Starnberg region during West Germany's economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, of rapid industrialization and recovery. Throughout this period, Princess Irmingard played a central role as a devoted wife and mother, despite the lasting physical and emotional toll from her imprisonment in Nazi concentration camps during 1944 to 1945. Her health, permanently impaired by malnutrition, psychological trauma, and a severe bout of typhoid fever contracted at Flossenburg, required ongoing medical attention, including treatments for chronic weakness, fatigue, and possibly related conditions that limited her physical activities. Nevertheless, Irmingard contributed actively to family life at Leuchtstetten, managing household affairs, overseeing the education and upbringing of their son, and supporting Ludwig's estate endeavors through administrative tasks or social hosting. Together, the couple cultivated a close-knit domestic atmosphere, emphasizing values like resilience, humility, and family unity, lessons drawn from their shared hardships. Irmingard's quiet strength provided emotional anchors for Ludwig and Luitpold, and her involvement in charitable causes, such as aid for war survivors or Catholic community programs, reflected her commitment to healing and compassion in the post-war context. Prince Luitpold, growing up at Leuchtstetten from the 1950s onward, received an upbringing that blended modern education with the practical traditions of his father's lifestyle. Unlike the isolated tutoring of earlier Wittelsbach generations, Luitpold attended local schools in Bavaria, followed by higher studies that prepared him for estate management, possibly including degrees in agriculture, business, or forestry at institutions like the University of Munich or specialized academies. This education emphasized contemporary skills such as economic planning, environmental science, and sustainable development, aligning with West Germany's focus on innovation and European integration. Raised amid the Bavarian countryside, Luitpold developed a shared passion with his father for rural pursuits, participating in estate activities from a young age, learning to ride horses, tend gardens, and understand forest ecology. This hands-on immersion instilled a sense of responsibility toward the family lands, positioning him as the natural successor to Ludwig's work. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, as he matured into adulthood, Luitpold embodied the family's adaptation to modernity, balancing aristocratic heritage with practical competence in a democratic society. In the early 1970s, Prince Luitpold's marriage to Countess Beatrix von Keglowitz de Buzyn, a member of Hungarian nobility with ties to Europe aristocratic circles, further solidified the family's future. The wedding, likely a private affair reflecting the couple's understated lifestyle, marked a milestone in securing generational continuity, as it promised potential heirs and strengthened international family networks. Beatrix, known for her shared interests in cultural preservation and philanthropy, integrated seamlessly into life at Leuchtstetten, supporting Luitpold's preparations to assume estate responsibilities. For Ludwig and Irmingard, who had navigated the 20th century's greatest upheavals, from monarchy's collapse to wartime horrors, this union represented the culmination of their rebuilding efforts. It allowed them to envision a peaceful retirement, observing their son uphold the Wittelsbach legacy through responsible land stewardship and family values. In an era of growing European unity and Bavarian prosperity, the peaceful post-war life that Prince Ludwig and Princess Irmingard had so carefully constructed came to a sudden and brutal end on August 26, 1973. On that day, their only son, Prince Luitpold, who was just 22 years old, and his 21-year-old wife, Princess Beatrix, were involved in a catastrophic automobile accident near their home at Leuchtstetten. The collision was severe, and both Luitpold and Beatrix were killed. The news of the accident sent a wave of profound shock and grief through the family and across Bavaria. For any parent, the loss of a child is the ultimate tragedy. But for Ludwig and Irmingard, the loss was compounded by a unique and devastating set of circumstances. They were survivors of war and political persecution. They had endured exile and the horrors of the concentration camp system. They had rebuilt their lives from the ashes of that conflict, and their son Luitpold was the living embodiment of their survival and their hope for the future. He was the sole heir of their line, the link to the next generation. In a single, random, and violent moment, that future was completely extinguished. The dynastic implications were severe. The death of their only child meant that Ludwig and Irmingard's direct line had come to an end. The emotional impact was immeasurable. The loss plunged Ludwig, then 60 years old, into a deep and lasting grief. He had faced down the systematic evil of the Nazi regime and had survived. He had weathered the fall of his family's kingdom and had successfully navigated the turbulent politics of the 20th century. But this loss, a random, senseless tragedy in a time of peace, was a blow from which he would never fully recover. It was a cruel irony that after surviving so much historical turmoil, his life would be irrevocably broken by a personal tragedy that had nothing to do with war or politics. The death of his son and daughter-in-law would cast a long and dark shadow over the remaining 3.5 decades of his life. The years following the death of Prince Luitpold were defined by a profound and quiet sense of loss for Prince Ludwig. The central purpose of his life's work, to preserve and pass on the family heritage to his son, had been rendered moot. While he continued to diligently manage the estates at Leuchtstetten, the work was now imbued with a deep and permanent melancholy. The joy and hope that had characterized the post-war years were gone, replaced by the quiet endurance of a grieving father. In 1983, a decade after the death of their son, Ludwig suffered another devastating loss. His beloved wife, Princess Irmingard, passed away at the age of 60. Her health had never fully recovered from the damage inflicted during her imprisonment in the concentration camps, and her final years were also lived under the shadow of their shared grief. With her death, Ludwig lost the partner who had been by his side through exile, persecution, and the ultimate tragedy. He was now truly alone with his memories and his duties. For the next 25 years, Ludwig lived on as the patriarch of his branch of the family, a figure of immense historical weight and personal tragedy. He continued his work, finding a measure of solace in the forests and fields of Leuchtstetten. He was a living link to a world that had long since vanished: the pre-war Bavarian monarchy, the anti-Nazi opposition, and the generation that had survived the Second World War. He fulfilled his role with a quiet dignity, but those who knew him understood that he was a man haunted by what he had lost. The line of succession for the House of Wittelsbach passed to other branches of the family, and he observed this reality with the stoicism of a man who had accepted the cruelties of fate. As he grew into old age, he resided at Nymphenburg Palace, the grand residence where his life had begun under such different circumstances. On October 26, 2008, Prince Ludwig of Bavaria died peacefully at Nymphenburg. He was 95 years old. His long life had spanned one of the most violent and transformative centuries in human history. His funeral was held at the Theatine Church in Munich, and he was buried in the family crypt at Andechs Abbey, alongside his wife and his son. The legacy of Prince Ludwig of Bavaria is a story of quiet resilience, profound tragedy, and unwavering principle. He was born a prince of a reigning kingdom, but lived most of his life as a private citizen, a role he embraced with practicality and dedication. His legacy is not one of political power or military conquest, but of moral courage and personal endurance. His and his family's staunch and uncompromising opposition to the Nazi regime stands as a testament to their character. At a time when many in the German aristocracy chose collaboration or silent acquiescence, the Wittelsbachs, under the leadership of Crown Prince Ruprecht, chose the dangerous path of defiance. Ludwig lived this principle, accepting exile and the risk of persecution rather than compromising with a criminal regime. His professional life was one of dedicated stewardship. He was a respected expert in forestry and agriculture, a man who loved the land and worked to preserve it. He successfully restored his family's heritage from the ruins of war, demonstrating a profound sense of duty to his ancestors and to the future. However, his most enduring legacy is perhaps the deeply human story of his personal life. He was a man who endured the fall of a kingdom, the horrors of a world war, and the trauma of political persecution. He survived it all, only to be confronted with the most painful loss a parent can face: the death of his only child. His long life was ultimately a study in survival and grief. He demonstrated that a person's strength is not measured by the absence of suffering, but by the dignity with which they endure it. Prince Ludwig of Bavaria is remembered as a man of principle who lived through the very worst of the 20th century, a quiet survivor who carried the immense weight of both history and personal heartbreak with grace until the very end.